This should be a study that's funded more by people who are skeptics of low carbers who have high LDL than it should be from the low carbers themselves. If you believe that low carbers are being very reckless with their high LDL, and again, this is me stating plainly, you could be right, then you should be absolutely in favor of us being able to make the study happen, because it should show in scans 1 year apart in CTA, very high resolution, that there's a high progression of atherosclerosis, particularly if you believe LDL is indeed causal and is log linear.
And so this is really cool. I mean, just so people know, this is what Dave is doing. He has a cohort of lean mass hyperresponders who are being followed longitudinally with sequential CTA scans. And I can't wait for the results, and we'll see. I know Spencer thinks it's going to be one way, and I think it's going to be the other way. And Dave is kind of impartial. He's the impartial observer. And I love that we're talking. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not truly impartial. I mean, I certainly, as I regularly say, I'm cautiously optimistic. But what I mean by cautiously optimistic is I'm not certain, and I have never claimed certainty that LDL doesn't cause atherosclerosis at a concentration level. But that said, given the information I've seen to date, given everything that I've looked at, and particularly when I look at combination data, I have come to a different conclusion, and I want to see this in the metabolic context. That's the thing. I think if there's any driver that we've got to put forward, and you know what, this actually is a good segue to get into what I want to say is, in my opinion, the proper framing of this debate. So I was on a podcast recently with Sigma Nutrition. That's Danny Lennon and Alan Flanagan. And let me first start off by saying they were total gentlemen, and I've had some great private conversations with them, even though they're very much pro-lipid hypothesis. I think it's been a very productive conversation. What happened is they were bringing up the so-called lipid triad. As you know, I like to identify, just to keep it at basic level, what we see often with low carbers and with lean mass hyperresponders, that their LDL goes up a lot, their HDL goes up a lot, and their triglycerides go down. So it's a triad. It's those three together. And they were discussing why it is that low carbers shouldn't feel comforted by that triad if it's alongside high LDL. So I then came onto their podcast and talked about that and tried to make the case for what I'd like to call the lipid profile versus lipoprotein centric viewpoint. But after the podcast happened, they ended up doing an article that kind of tried to address a lot of the things I brought up in the podcast. And after reading the article, I thought, well, I could do a very exhaustive point by point on a lot of the things they're bringing up, but I really kind of want to next level this. In fact, I want to next level this with everybody, because there seems to be this constant talking past each other in this critical role of context. So how best can I frame what it is that I would consider to be compelling data and that meets the Bradford Hill criteria? And it's pretty simple. I'm going to start linguistically calling these two different sets of data. One set of data is single lipid data. So if you look at a lipid marker in isolation, that's single lipid data. The other is combination lipid data, where you're going to actually look at lipids alongside other lipid markers. Now, in order to say, hey, we can make the case that LDL is causal with single lipid data, you have to be able to confirm that that's the case also with combination lipid data. You can't make the case only in single lipid data, because that's a category that's lumping both the lipid triad and atherogenic dyslipidemia together. You see the problem?
Exactly. That's exactly what we're talking about.
And that's the issue is you're bringing up things that may or may not be relevant, which is, of course, a population that's already sick, which we already know. If you were to just grab a random number of Americans, you're going to find what we already see in the statistics, which is many of them are in a disease state. And we don't know from that how many of those have, say, atherogenic dyslipidemia, which is like the opposite of the triad. It's low HDL and high triglycerides. We don't know how much that affects LDL levels downstream. Mm-hmm. Now, in order to make the case for a single lipid data to be causal, you need to likewise state plainly that you're certain that things like atherogenic dyslipidemia do not affect lipid levels like LDL, since that is the point of interest. In other words, in order to say A causes B, you need to be sure of two things that are not the case, which is that B has any effect over A. And this is important, that there's no C or D or E or anything that's causing both. So simply stated, just like with Bradford Hill, to meet consistency, you shouldn't be able to find any population for which, say, smoking causes longevity, right? For the same reason, you shouldn't be able to see any population for which high LDL causes longevity. If you believe it is a net risk outcome, you should have the wide open invitation that I could go and find anything. And that's why, like, I think from now on, I just need to be more clear, especially if the conversation comes up, that I'm very interested in lipid numbers. And I'm especially interested in looking at LDL. I'm just not interested in looking at LDL in isolation.
In a vacuum, you can't look at LDL without context.
Because it doesn't give me a lot of information. And I've got a good analogy to show you everything that we can see in making a single metric case, and that's body weight. So body weight associates with, for example, blood pressure. The higher your body weight, the more likely your blood pressure increases, right? And generally speaking, if you just grab a bunch of random people and you have them lose body weight, their blood pressure is going to go down. Are there genetic factors that can result in higher body weight? Yes. If you have genetic factors that result in higher body weight, does that often associate with higher blood pressure? Yes. Okay, if you have an intervention that just randomly grabs people and it reduces their body weight, will it likewise reduce their blood pressure? Yeah, actually, just in general and random, right? Okay, so obviously somebody who's being annoying can come in and say, look, this is obvious, this can be applying to people who are obese and not be applying to those people who are, say, bodybuilders. We need to at least be able to confirm that that applies to both groups independently. That meets Bradford Hill. So let's go look at those people who don't just have a higher body weight, but also have, for example, a smaller waist to height ratio. And if you say to that person, no, we have enough data, we've done 1,000 studies on body weight's association with blood pressure to where we can make the claim that it's causal, you don't meet the Bradford Hill criteria. This is what's great about Bradford Hill. It already had that built in. It's already baked into his existing assessments. And that's what I would say, not just to Sigma Nutrition, but to anybody who wants to look just at single lipid data as the only primary means to make a case for causality.